So, howdy, folks. I'm Jonathan Reiter. I'm a software engineer by trade. Before that, I was a China study student for around a decade. In this talk, I'll be presenting the synthesis of these two areas, the background context one should have when performing research on PRC-based network operations. By PRC, I mean People's Republic of China. We'll be delving into a combination of sociology, history, politics, and technology. We'll be doing this with cheap and open source resources. So if one were so inclined, you could do all this at home. I'll also be discussing Baijiu, which is a fine Chinese spirit and another one of my loves. Pictured here on the slide is Hongxing Argoto, or Red Star 2 Batch. It's one of the emblems of the city of Beijing, and it's the best rock gut one can buy for 20 renminbi, or around 2 USD, circa like 2018. A final note before we start, I'm going to be covering a lot of material with this talk. Ask away with questions on Slack. We'll be doing a semi-prepared hunt at the end of the security portion of this talk. If you have any ideas for hunt topics, Slack them out. If we have time, we'll demo the topics. So moving forward, here's our agenda. We're going to first talk about security, and then we're going to talk about booze, or Baijiu. Kind of cutting it in half is a bottle of my favorite Baijiu in existence. It's called Wu Liangyia. It's from Sichuan. It's kind of whiskey, Scotch flavored. Within security, we're going to breeze through telecom, search engines, social media, and how to hunt. And when we talk about the internet in this, I'm talking about a decentralized system of mostly TCP/IP enabled networks that connect the world. But sometimes only does so selectively within China. And then China for this, again, I'm talking specifically about the People's Republic of China in 2023. So what is the internet in China? So roughly there are 4 states of the internet in China, which roughly correspond to a similar, if not phase shifted boom in the US. You have the beginnings of a telecom infrastructure, which is, one could say, fairly modern. Just like all developing nations, there was a late start to the history of the PRC's internet, and it represents the development of largely a state-coordinated system. We go over telecom because it speaks to market-state relations of the country throughout history and explains the ultimate consolidation of network capacity over time. In 1995 to 2005, we have kind of an academic hinterlands where you get these tables from. You have essentially the regulator dictating the work that what is essentially the education sector can set up as far as what becomes the internet exchange system of the country. All these interconnects become very important core systems that later the ISPs and eventually the .com industry, industries build off of, which explodes around 2005 in what is a exponential growth. You can see it on the graph of internet users in the PRC below here. This leads to companies like Baijiu and Tencent coming in the forefront. And eventually there's a consolidation that happens around 2015 to now. So starting with telecom, there's a lot of stuff going on here. The history of all computing in China is a history of industrial development. The 3 largest ISPs in modern times we have China Telecom, China Unicom, and China Mobile, and all of them are state-owned enterprises with their own distinct operating structure and history of sponsorship by the state. All of them are sponsored by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, or MIIT. That was an organization that was originally founded to cover telecom, but was originally associated with the Ministry of Posts, which is mail related. And this in turn has a legacy in colonial trade and customs systems that were way prior to the PRC, so during the Republican era, and even in the early Qing dynasty. However, the ownership of telecom assets falls under another organization called SASAC. SASAC is the largest economic organization in the world. It controls $30 trillion US as of 2021. And it manages all the assets for every state-owned enterprise in the PRC. And so China Telecom, Unicom, and Mobile all are under SASAC. Now going one by one. So China Telecom is the biggest and oldest telco in the country. It has about $100 billion in USD assets, and it was incorporated in 1995 directly from, again, the Ministry of Posts. And it underwrote the development of nearly every fixed line system in the country, including those that the People's Liberation Army depend on. China Unicom, on the other hand, is one of its main competitors, is formed by a union of industrial ministries in competition with the Ministry of Posts. What China Unicom has going for it is it was the earliest entry in the CDMA space in China and expanded rapidly CDMA globally, later only getting spurned with their growth in the US and Canada for reasons which are probably pretty obvious. And then China Mobile is the late entry here. It now has the majority of the CDMA services in the world. They end up getting most of China Telecom's assets in a kind of merger situation. And they also got a bunch of fixed line business from China Railroad. To this day, China Mobile is one of the largest CDMA providers in the world by a pretty large margin. It has about 1 billion customers and has a 70% domestic market share. So that makes it one of the biggest ISPs in the world as well. So in general, the story from 1999 to 2000 is the story of the state industrial sector working with a surge of consumer growth on traditional telecom lines. You have millennials today who remember that the first day that they got a telephone in their house. And this whole setup is the foundation in which the internet would be built. Meanwhile, you have academia and exchanges, academia leading the way when it comes to exchanges. On the left, we have the CERNet, which is the main academic network, and all of its data centers laid out. You can see the thick red lines are essentially the 100 gigabit links, and then the thinner go into 10 gig links. It's kind of a hub and spoke system that is surrounding, as you can imagine, the academic center of the country, Beijing and Shanghai, and it expands out to the commercial bases, which would be Guangzhou, which is also the site of Tencent's headquarters. On the right, you have essentially how the global peering works for CERNet. You may see CERNet 2, which is the IPv6 version of it. This whole system peers academically through a system called TANE2. But there's some interesting things to note about how the IX system works in China. It's extremely controlled, at least CERNet is, to the extent that it causes major connectivity bottlenecks. Usually when you have a hiccup between going from, say, internationally to China, it's not just the length of the cable that is the hiccup, but also the actual IX peering. Additionally, CERNet as an academic organization has its own kind of constraints to how it's come about. So it was largely driven by, this whole setup is driven by Tsinghua University in Beijing in 1994. Tsinghua is roughly the equivalent of MIT. There are really close ties between CERNet and an organization called the Computer Network Information Center, which is run by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, so-called CINIC. CINIC, in turn, runs the majority of the domain services of the country. Because CERNet is under the Ministry of Education, it also runs the National College Admittance Exam system using those same data centers, and that is the largest test system in the world. It also manages university networking, which, as you can imagine, has its mandate expanded since the beginning of COVID. And yeah, so it has, in general, CERNet kind of shows the complex relationship that the official lines have in IX with connecting the outside world. Nowadays, post 2010, most global peering actually occurs through ISPs and cloud services, however. So this leads us to the dot-com boom, how the ISPs and dot-com businesses got into the internet business. So while academic peering led to the growth of a globally connected network, ultimately today we see the predominance of ISPs and favored dot-com startups Companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, and Baijiu, each of them had parabolic growth from 2000 to 2020, emerging as national champions into what is a rather cornered market, one which since 2021 has been subject to greater and greater levels of state supervision. In one case, you have the state taking what's called golden shares of companies, more or less a controlling stake. And then on the other hand, you have personal discipline and persecution, which a good example of this is Jack Ma, the CEO of Alibaba, who was more or less pushed out of his company to leave to Japan. This table right here is pretty straightforward. I took the sum of census assigned to each organization alongside Shodan and Gray Noise. Census and Shodan are both internet scanners. They look for advertising IP addresses and can look up and grabs banners and etc. Gray Noise is a scanner of scanners, and you can see from this contemporary table, we have Alibaba. You have companies like Alibaba, which is the startup, and China Telecom kind of head to head with hosting. When you look at the scanners, the state apparatuses, for reasons which I think are quite obvious, take up far more scanner turf. So yeah, moving on to reasons one should scan, search engines. So search engines work a little bit differently in China than in the rest of the world. Ultimately, there's 4 rules that the domestic content kind of rules the roost, and domestic providers are still a huge part of search traffic. It favors PRC websites, and this is based off the actual search algorithm. It will favor 2 different factors, one of which is, does it have Chinese in its content? The second of which, does the site have an ICP license, meaning have they gone to the MIIT organization I mentioned previously, gotten signed off that, okay, your content looks okay, therefore, we can issue a license. So as a result, the whole search engine system in China is it's less sophisticated. It doesn't look at dynamic page content much, and it does very simple image crawling. Using something like Baijiu is like using a search, it's like using Google from like 2010. It's very simple. It also favors very simple page structures. So applied, this has some very simple connotations. It's that, Chinese is hard for computers. Yeah, a lot of this has to do with not only how the encodings work, but how people express themselves online, dealing with the complexities of the encodings. So right here, the characters I have right here is Guoyu, which means Chinese or Mandarin. And Guoyu can be expressed with characters. This is simplified characters. It can be represented with pinyin, which is Roman Latin characters with diacritics that say which tone it is. You can initialize the pinyin. In this case, is GY for Guoyu, which this is a very important thing to learn because it's very common with web resources. And then the actual Chinese characters themselves have a Unicode formation, which sometimes is parsed by scanners and sometimes not. It's worth noting that Shodan as a service didn't allow searching with Chinese Unicode characters up until very recently. A final comparable kind of grok, similar to the initialism I talked about, is numbers. There's rhyming schemes that are adopted by numbers. Alibaba is 1688.com, which in Chinese is pronounced as Yao Liu Ba Ba, which sounds, I guess, fairly similar to Alibaba. So both of these are approaches you can take for trying to make sense of how web resources work when we're doing hunting. Social media. So when we talk about, so a lot of this simplicity of search engines exists for a reason, and that's because there's only so much you can get away with a sensor. And so that led to a lot of companies, web startups, focusing on vertical integration. And if we're talking from 2010 on, we are talking specifically about social media. Nowadays, it has gotten to a point where it's kind of a monopoly in the market. Tencent's WeChat has a market pretty much sewn up, and it's largely because they became the de facto standard for mobile payments in WeChat Pay, especially during COVID, as well as a model for app store circumvention. Pretty much every major social media app has its own app store, which it uses to circumvent the app stores for both Android and iOS. There's competition for WeChat and ByteDance's Douyin, which we think of as Sina Weibo. And the main context of social media in general is microblogging. It never really went away in the PRC, and in fact, it's more or less supplanted all of email. So as a result, long-form content is a lot more common. As you can imagine, the censorship capabilities have been scaled over the years to compensate for this. While this talk won't go into depth about the technical details of censorship, that's kind of a talk all its own. The expansion and usage of the expansion of expression has led to greater intercept powers and this formation of a centralized intelligence capabilities in China. Largely, this has been through something that's called the Golden Shield Project, which basically took the net of all the decentralized ministries of public security who are in charge of monitoring all sorts of discourse online, and it turned it into a giant national network. So that kind of defines the precepts here, that national network. So you don't talk about moderation. You're forced into using real names, at least since 2017. And if you have a server that is based in the PRC, you can assume it has some degree of intercept powers. So one last thing before we get hunting, this is kind of a coda. There's a profession and hobby of security in the PRC, just like there is in any other nation. And there's roughly 5 precepts to that. One, the modern history of hacktivism kind of drives the professional market of security researchers. And largely it's a trend that's based off of a combination of nationalism and paternalism. The Honker Union, seen all the way to the left, is one of the most infamous collectives, and it was formed as a response to an upswelling of nationalism around the time the US accidentally bombed a Chinese embassy in Belgrade. It was around 2000. Inversely, however, proxy technology in the PRC has advanced based on the impulse of people to operate unseen and to try to get around the Great Firewall. So you have software like shadow socks that grew out of ways to avoid state surveillance. And it's also used by adversaries as well. So you have other like proxy technology within Alchemist and the Stowaway frameworks. A third point is, over time, the operators have become more commercialized. KnownSec was founded largely by former Phantom members, and Phantom itself was a contemporary of the Honker Union. So Adam Cozy of formerly CrowdStrike and Intrusion Truth, which is it's a whistleblower for APT groups. They both write extensively about this connection. Fourth point is security operations is big business in China. You have Qihoo 360 and Tianqin, which have their own telemetry platforms and modern reporting, and they operate at scales that are pretty comparable to CrowdStrike and other international players. If you're curious about the reporting piece, I've translated the latest Tianqin APT report. If you message me, I can send you a translation. I will eventually have a dedicated link for this. Some of the observations from this that I've noticed is there's a lot of claims that are not necessarily substantiated with IOCs, but are regardless interested. One of those claims is that Cozy Bear is possibly targeting overseas PRC energy stations in Central Asia, and they're doing it through terminal management systems and using Rust Trojans, which is that's a whole combination of really interesting stuff, but they don't show any IOCs, probably because the state would prefer the organization not to describe this further. Another interesting thing noted is there's an APT group called APTQ45, which seems to target Belt and Road industrial operations in Pakistan. But again, this comes with limited evidence. It's just you have to take our word on it. So in sum, these kind of reports tend to be pretty cagey with details for original works. It's possible for national security purposes. They're also fairly lax with citations of non-original work. But overall, if you were to compare the APT report from 2022 versus its first one in 2015, it's the amount of professionalism is pretty breathtaking over the years. So it's now hunt time. We're going to use 3 resources. I have kind of a setup hunt framework that I've been doing. I've my own log that I'm going to go through quite shortly. And the 3 resources we're going to depend on mostly are Shodan, which I have an individual account, which you can get for like $8 when it comes on sale. Census, again, both these services are used for scanning hosts and like grabbing banners and seeing what's on each port. Census, I have a completely free account. Gray Noise, I have a free account, but thanks to their MVP their VIP program, I do have slightly greater access than usual, but you can do everything I'm about to show you with a free account. So now it is demo time. I'm going to pop up to some special tabs where I'm going to work through some of these hunts. And we're going to do this until roughly 35 minutes in which case we'll move on to Baijiu stuff. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is Tianjin related. So I was looking around for Tianjin stuff, just kind of Googling their name. And when I say Google, I mean I use Google and I also use Baidu to search for its actual name, which if you've ever used Baidu, it actually has a pinyin translation to Han. It has an input method where if you type in pinyin if you type in Latin characters, it will automatically switch over to the Chinese characters. So it'd be super useful. And in general, when I was looking at Tianjin, I found this really interesting PR release, which it's clearly machine translated. It's on a throwaway domain, but it mentioned a bunch of its code names. Just like, I wonder where these code names show up. And so I brought the code name to Shodan, and I found something interesting. Okay, first of all, I can tell it's Tianjin because it has Tianjin within the cert. But where does Noah show up? Here, I'll do a quick search on this. Oh, here is a Kafka broker. Again, this is historical data. This is, if you were to go to this IP right now, it wouldn't show any of this. This goes back to September of last year. I've been hunting for a while. These are a bunch of Kafka topics that are just available. And some of them are really interesting. Some of them tell you what they're tracking. Oh, they're tracking FTP traffic. That's a good idea. If I had a threat platform, I'd do that. Some of them give you more code names to look at. What the heck is SkyEye and why is it looking at ICMPs? What is it doing with IOCs? And then another thing you got out of this, which I think is also quite interesting, is you can see its industry connections. Aliyun is here. What is Aliyun? Aliyun is Alibaba. Why is Alibaba here? Well, it could be that it's getting layer 7 logs from Alibaba, which is a cloud provider in this case. That was only one part of this hunt, believe it or not. There is actually something more interesting here, which is a gigantic Elasticsearch database. It is 13 terabytes in size. It is accruing terabytes of data per day. You can see, based off of the suffix of the Elasticsearch index, that it is accruing daily. This is again from September, and it goes back maybe 2 weeks, maybe up to a month. It's hard to tell. And again, you get way interesting data at pretty huge scales. So here's a bunch of login data. It's a gigabyte. Here, let's see if we can find larger stuff. There's web attack data. Who knows where it's from? It's flow data. We know that much. And it even has some ways to probably transition Webflow over to PCAPs. Oh, sure. Okay, so this is what the index looks like. Yeah, so we see PCAP indices, we see flow, lots of GBs on this. And in fact, the biggest is in fact TCP flow going back a week. But yeah, in general, you get some ideas of what Tianjin's platform is doing. And And that inspired another kind of hunt in a completely unrelated day. I was looking up CTF gear, and I found another interesting breadcrumb, which is I was looking for stuff related to CTF platforms, and I came upon a SecWorld, a site with the SecWorld cert. SecWorld is a much smaller security organization based in Beijing. There's a VPN. Don't get much information out of that on the cert. However, there are some interesting terms here. This is an attack training platform, which again, it's a CTF platform. That's how I read it. And I was like, okay, 4610 has some sort of platform. Let me check it out. And lo and behold, this is a Chinese for Qianxin. Qianxin has a joint project with SecWorld in running some amount of security training, and perhaps a CTF. There's additional resources can be found based on this breadcrumb. If you're to look up patents, for example, in which case you find that they have a couple joint patents together, looking at some interesting attack methodology. Beyond the Qianxin space, another resource I use again is Gray Noise. Gray Noise is very useful for finding infected hosts, and it will automatically classify them with some amount of intelligence. In this case, I found an IP. It's infected with a worm that was pulling for RDP. It's very easy to correlate the tag that says it looks like an RDP worm, because, let me zoom in as well. It's running on port 3389. It's scanning 3389, which is, again, it's, in this case, is an RDP port. Another thing that I believe dropped out of the history of Gray Noise is it was scanning for Microsoft SQL Server instances, which is a pretty good indicator that there's a worm here. And so I also checked out the IP in Shodan, which I will not be showing you because the data for this actually dropped out of the history of Shodan. But I was able to get some host data off of it. I learned that it was running, although it says Windows 7.8 here, what was actually running was an outdated version of Windows 2008 R2. Perfect for targeting for a SQL worm and MS SQL worm. And I found out that it was a state agency that was running it. It was not an important state agency, as I'll show you in the email I sent. It was in fact just a low-level county that was running an emergency meteorology center. And the fact that it was an emergency meteorology center kind of drove me to send this email, where I say bilingually, "Hey, it looks like I think you got a worm. I hope it's really not a worm, but here's some resources to take a look in which fit my analysis." And I never heard back from them, which makes me a little sad. But I can tell that something was done, because if you look at the date when I sent this, it was December 23rd, and the host was polled in January. So again, it's not conclusive proof, but it's an indicator that perhaps I contributed to somebody's security awareness, hopefully. Okay, one last thing before I check Slack if anybody has interest for hunting areas, which we will do until 35 after. One last thing. So I did some searches on a key term, which I thought was going to be fairly interesting. This term, I'll zoom in a little bit more again. It is CNC which means information collection. And believe you me, this is a really fun term to look for, because CNC is a term that's used very commonly in, let's say, headline terms, in both interesting government and public security sites. So I trolled through these for a while, and I found it was a fairly interesting site. So I'll go through this a little slower this time. So some things to note: is hosted in Alibaba. It is an Alibaba site that is in Shenzhen. It is fairly stacked. It's hosting on a bunch of HTTP sites. It is very common to find hosts which are stacked in China, which is to say one server, multiple organizations hosting stuff on them. I'm not necessarily sure why this is the case, other than perhaps it's a function of thrift. Like it's a lot easier to save compute resources doing that. But yeah, so we have an 80 hosted, we have a 443 hosted. We'll go to the 443 later. And again, this is where it shows up, Saiji. It has a cert, which uses the same initialism system we were talking about. SHZ is a common 3-letter term for Shenzhen. I haven't yet been able to figure out what YCJ stands for. It uses Trust Asia. Trust Asia is one of the most common cert providers in the country. There are cert providers in the country which are untrusted by browsers. They are less commonly used because of that, because for international sites, because of that issue. And you find here, this is a human resources portal, but nonetheless, it garnered my interest. So I jumped in here, and there's a wealth of interesting data here. Guiyang is right here. Guiyang is a city in Guizhou, which is not in Shenzhen. It's not close to Shenzhen. You have an organization that created this. KSIC is an aeronautics, it's an aeronautics SOE, which is also interesting. I'm not sure why they did the web development here. You also have a interesting link here that says help with use. And if we go to the help page, start from the top. Again, you get some more interesting details. Guizhou Gong'an. Gong'an is PSB, it's Public Security Bureau. And it's basically about their tooling. And okay, so there's some interesting stuff already here. You have a slew of windows that are supported. Also, you have a URL to something called usbdriver.zip, which when I saw that, I was, okay, I need to read this a little bit more closely. And I don't need to do any translation for this because it's going to be really clear what this is. It's a device. What? What do you do with a device? And you're allowing it access to browsers. See, the straightforward thing about what this is right here is it's a keylogger. Because ultimately the responsibility of running keyloggers on public compute or getting, say, academic organizations disseminating, giving students like, here, okay, you're running something in a computer lab, be sure to run this to fulfill the requirements of local PSB. You know, they are in charge of transmitting keyloggers. So simply by looking at an interesting keyword and following that chain, I was able to find a keylogger in the one. So that was roughly the canned hunts I've done. We have, I want to say, 2 minutes is not quite enough to go into to do live hunts, but I will after this presentation, what I will do is I will engage with you and see if we can work together on some items. I'll answer questions at the very end, and for the actual hunt topics, I can work with you offline. So we will now jump over to the Baijiu part of this presentation. So what is Baijiu? What have I been showing you guys? So Baijiu is a clear spirit, as you can see from this bottle right here. This is Bean Baijiu, which is, surprisingly, it is distilled in the greater Portland, Oregon metropolitan area, which I will get to in a second. So Baijiu is a clear spirit with high ABV, like 50 to 150 proof, which initially it makes you think it's something like vodka or Everclear. It's cultivated all throughout China, using nearly every carbohydrate you can think of. So again, it's similar to vodka. People make it with sorghum, people make it with wheat, rice, you name it. It's also pretty similar to shochu in that, because you have like sweet potato shochu, and likewise, I'm sure sweet potato baijiu exists. However, unlike vodka, it has a much more broad palate. So in my mind, it makes it a little closer to mezcal. Some like the Beijing Hongqing Arboto that I showed in the first slide, or the Guizhou-based Maotai. Maotai is probably the most famous baijiu of all. They aspire to be neutral flavor. They taste like, again, vodka or Everclear. My favorite, which I showed maybe the third or fourth slide, is the Sichuan-based Wuliangya, and that tastes like Scotch. It's smokier, it's more complex. But there's an entire world of baijiu that is herb-infused and made for medicinal purposes. There's tea-infused baijiu. There's baijiu that's made to taste almost chemical-like. There's baijiu that's made to taste almost like soy sauce. All of it is very provincial and dependent on the local taste. So why is it so provincial? It's because it's been distilled since the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was, about 2,000 years ago. So it's common for every old county in China to have their own distinctive baijiu. And just like other liquors, they've created a connoisseurship culture as, it's wholly based on individual preferences. The comparable point is like peatiness and whiskey. How much peat or smoke you get in your Scotch? Well, it depends on what part of Scotland you're in. And then in a greater essence, it depends on what part of the world you're in, because there's Irish whiskey and there's Japanese whiskey and there's American bourbon and whiskey and Canadian bourbon and whiskey. Baijiu is also super popular. More than 10 billion liters of baijiu was consumed in 2019, and that's around half the global volume of vodka for that year. Another thing worth noting is that baijiu cocktails have grown in popularity in China. You have metropolitan cities like Beijing and Shanghai, and they try to make mixed drinks using them. Some of them are kind of harkening back to traditional tastes. So you have baijiu cocktails with goji berries are really, really common. Some of them are very new school, however. Some of them use demerara sugar, and they treat really high proof baijiu almost like it's an overproof rum. It's very interesting. And in use of mixed drinks, it's kind of exploded in the West. So Vin, the vendor who've created this baijiu on the slide, they make mostly neutral flavored spirits, but they're used in cocktails in a lot of different bars throughout Portland. And it's not common to be drunk straight up. It's more likely to be used in a mixed drink. Similar to, I suppose, soju has been used, and shochu have both been used in mixed drinks frequently as well. So getting more into the culture of baijiu. As mentioned, baijiu has been around for about 2,000 years. Prior to the last few centuries, it had less than modern distillation, so you ended up with around 15% ABV drink. And so it's really similar up until the last 100 years to its non-distilled antecedent, which is rice and sorghum wines, which are called Mijiu and Huangjiu, respectively. Those in turn have been around since. Right time? Okay.